This is publicly accessible land, and it should be used for broad public purposes. And one of those purposes is to preserve our natural heritage. We need to conserve random natural diversity. If all the sycamore in here and sweet gum are going to die out because it's getting too much water in the system, let it happen and see what else comes up to replace it. Probably river birch, and eventually it'll go back to pin oak and swamp cottonwood. But we're not letting nature do that anywhere. Everywhere on the DNR's land, even in the nature preserve system now, they're picking winners and losers.
While we have plenty of big oak trees right now, and we have plenty of very tiny seedlings, that there is a gigantic gap between the two. In other words, those baby seedlings are not making it to adulthood. And one only has to project that out a series of decades to know that as those older oak trees die, there are no oak trees to replace them. If oak disappears from the forest, even if it takes decades to happen, that's going to have a catastrophic ripple effect into these migratory songbirds that are coming from Central and South America to nest here. And so we feel this compulsion to try to make sure we get oak back in the forest. And the best way to do that, we think, is through keeping enough light in the forest and bringing fire back to its place.
Why is it important to leave it like this? Because first of all, we need a large baseline of forest lands in the state, of wetlands and things that are functioning naturally so that we have some way of gauging our own impact on the land. We also need them to sequester carbon. These old forests store an absolutely immense amount of carbon. These are the greatest machines we know of for addressing climate change, these forests. And the older they are, the more carbon they store. The greater the native biodiversity, natural diversity of the species that were here to begin with, the healthier the system is. Everybody thinks that Brazil needs to get its act together to stop wiping out species in the tropical rainforest. Well, we're doing it right here. You know, most of the spiders we found out in the eco-blitz in Morgan Monroe Yellowwood live in the forest litter, including new species never before seen in this state. What happens when you do prescribed burns? You burn up the forest litter. The bugs are eating the forest alive. And so the predators are really important. Well, in a very biodiverse systems, there are lots of predators. And when you just start wiping that out, you start wiping out the predators, you have less control on these invertebrates.
There is a very tight connection between songbirds and oak hickory forest. There are birds that like this open canopy forest or this open forest that we see. Red-headed woodpeckers love this kind of open forest with lots of big trees scattered in it, especially oak trees. And we have this set of neotropical migratory birds. So the birds that are moving from Central and South America back and forth to Indiana and the Midwest and using these hardwood forests, they need the food resource that's here, and that's caterpillars. And so we know, scientists have determined that oak trees and hickory trees will have more caterpillars on them, caterpillar species, than beech or maple will. We also know there's a connection, a kind of mysterious connection, with a very rare bird known as the cerulean warbler, which is endangered in Indiana, to white oak. They nest in white oak woods, and they like white oak trees, and that's where we'll find their nests. They have their own niche, right? And that is, they are feeding on the caterpillars that would otherwise eat the leaves of the oak trees. And they are feeding on spiders. So there's this check and balance that goes on. Oak is what's called a disturbance-dependent species. And that is, there are things in its environment that, if disturbed, will help it to outcompete other trees. So fire is helpful in that oaks are adapted to, even when they're tiny, they're adapted to fire burning across them, and then they'll resprout. They don't like too much light, and they don't like too little light. And so you kind of got to have this medium level of light in the forest to get oak back.
What they're really fighting here is natural succession. And what they're fighting is biodiversity that increases in these forests as they age.
There is always a trade-off, and there's always a risk to all these things we do. And so I think if we're good managers, we have to acknowledge the risks. to pretend like there's no risk to just leaving the forest alone is not being completely forthcoming about what's happening out there. So we need to have oak back in. And I agree with the fact that if we just left the forest alone, it would be fine. But we need to leave it alone with fire, because fire was in there. And we can't ignore the fact that these forests were adapted to fire for centuries, or millennia, actually.
The burn is designed to kill, 80+% of all the native tree species out here. They don't survive burns. So if you do this constant burning, they start dying and dropping out of the system. The tulip poplar, the black cherry, the American elm, slippery elm, the sassafras even, although it tends to be tougher. Black walnut, white walnut, that's pretty rare, but it's here. Black gum, American basswood. All these forests are incredibly diverse. That's why they call them the mixed mesophytic hardwood forests of eastern North America. Some of the most diverse temperate forests on the planet. We're the last defense the forest has got.
I am moving my own forest towards some greater, older, bigger trees faster, I believe, than just leaving it alone.